It's almost 4 years since the Syrian civil war began amid the optimism of the Arab Spring. It's degenerated into a brutal conflict that has killed over 200,000 people and shattered the lives of millions more. It's also seen young Western Muslims traveling to Syria to fight, many joining competing groups such as ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, al-Qaeda's Syrian arm. For this exclusive People and Power report, Nagieb Khaja went to find out why they're there and the implications for global security.
It's May 2014 in northwest Syria. It's the first of several visits here as I attempt to negotiate access to al-Qaeda's Syrian arm, Jabhat al-Nusra. It's one of the most powerful jihadist groups fighting the Syrian regime, and I want to understand what is drawing young Western Muslims to join them. An airplane has started to circle around the area again. Nusra and its allies are carving out a new Islamic state here to rival ISIS' self-styled caliphate in the east. And it's under heavy attack from regime aircraft. Senior Nusra members are extremely cautious. They don't use phones or email. It takes 3 days just to pass on a message, and all I can do is wait. You can hear it. Airstrike. It's quite terrifying actually to live in this area. Eventually, in December, after several failed attempts and weeks of scrutiny from Nusra security people, I'm finally being taken to meet the Egyptian-Australian Nusra official, Abu Sulayman Muhajir. A former preacher in Sydney, he's been in Syria for at least 2 years and is on the most wanted list of Western intelligence agencies. It's actually the first time that a high-ranking member of Jabhat al-Nusra is going to talk to a Western journalist. I don't know the destination, the place where I'm going to meet him. I've just been told by one of the Nusra members that I'm driving with to blindfold myself, and they told me to do it because of the security situation. Early on in the civil war, al-Qaeda's Syrian franchise, Jabhat al-Nusra, emerged as the most powerful and secretive rebel force. But then in mid-2013, in a very public conflict on the jihadi blogosphere, ISIS splintered from Nusra's ranks and mounted a bloody challenge for control of territory and ideology. Abu Sulayman was a mediator between the two groups as they attempted to reconcile, but afterwards sided with Nusra. I wanted to ask him what al-Nusra was doing in Syria and why they were now in competition with ISIS.
Jabhat al-Nusra is the sole official representative of al-Qaeda in Syria. Our main efforts may be local, but they are part of a wider international Islamic movement. All Islamic movements around the world want an Islamic state, but the IS group have defined themselves as the exclusive bearers of Islam, delegitimizing the rest of the Muslim community and its efforts.
Back in Europe, as I was trying to understand this, I sought the help of an expert on ISIS and al-Nusra.
The main difference seems to be the way they treat others. ISIS just wanted to dominate and crushed any competitors. So in that sense, the ISIS model was very successful initially, but I think that Nusra will be the winner in the long run. On the one hand, it wants to be Islamist and it's worried that ISIS has stolen that franchise. On the other hand, they don't want to be brutal. They're trying to say, look, we are more with the people, we're more indigenous, we're willing to work with you, we're more flexible.
But this is still al-Qaeda, and along with ISIS, the US is targeting them with drone and airstrikes. Last September, America targeted an al-Nusra unit, codenamed the Khorasan Group, that the White House said was dedicated specifically to planning and launching terrorist attacks in the West.
This is not a new war. We all knew the attack was coming and their final justification to invade was arbitrary.
They claim that they are only targeting a group who have been tasked specifically with attacking the West.
Look, there's a clear disparity between what they say they do and what they actually do on the ground. They said they formed the coalition to attack the IS group. Then they went about targeting any group they suspect will not fall in line with US foreign policy, and then serve them in the region and serve their interests.
Who did they target then?
Look, Nagieb, I'm not going to get into who they did and who they didn't target. That would be breaching security. I'll say this much. They hit Islamic groups from all over Syria, from the borders of Iraq to the borders of Turkey.
I went to investigate the site of the first strikes for myself.
This is the boring areas of Syria, man.
What is it?
The boring areas of Syria.
Why is this place boring?
It's not green enough. If there was no jihadi, I don't think I would ever come here.
I'm sitting here with Amr Dagais, who's a British foreign fighter and a part of Jabhat al-Nusra. And we are on our way to where his friend Khalil Kamara was killed by an American attack.
"22-year-old Amr is the last of 4 young jihadis from Brighton in the south of England who came here secretly in 2013. As well as losing Kamara last year, Amr's 2 teenage brothers, Abdullah and Jafar, were also killed. Amr had been fighting as a freelancer, but he recently put himself on the international terrorist list by swearing allegiance to al-Nusra.
Looks like the hit came from this side, huh?
Yeah.
In the front. Oh, that's Khalil's. That's definitely Khalil's. I remember that.
How long have you and Khalil been friends?
Since 2009. That's about...
So you were friends from back then, from Brighton?
Yeah.
They say that they targeted people here in Syria because they were an imminent threat of an attack on America.
Well, for sure, this place wasn't. You know, they were just militarily. They were just normal soldiers here.
Has Khalil ever told you that he had plans of going back to Britain or the States, committing attacks?
No, never. It just makes things clear who their real enemy is.
Amr takes me to another bombed-out building 5 minutes down the road, where the leadership of the so-called Khorasan group is alleged to have plotted attacks against the West.
This is the place where the Al-Qaeda veteran Abu Yusuf al-Turki, a renowned sharpshooter, he was killed together with other members of Jabhat al-Nusra.
There is a lot of confusion around who this Khorasan group actually is, or if it even existed at all. But what we do know is that many of those who died were part of a sniper unit that called itself the Wolves, a unit led by al-Turki.
We bombed them on the first day when we bombed ISIS to lay down a marker, and I think that Obama did it for a number of reasons. First, perhaps they were legitimately frightened of it, but secondly, they wanted to let the world know that they're not just bombing ISIS, who had chopped off American heads in Iraq, but they're rolling this into the larger fight against al-Qaeda, terrorism, and the defense, self-defense. So it had a big banner saying, "We're defending the homeland."
Whatever the truth about the Khorasan group, it's young men like Amr who Western intelligence services fear the most. Abu Sulayman makes the threat clear.
Their choice is simple. Leave our lands, stop interfering in our affairs, or face a perpetual war. They rob our resources, they back tyrants, they force regime change, and they economically enslave our nations.
I mean, why do they see me as a threat? Is it because they have guilty conscience? Is it because what they have done to the Muslims? It's almost like they're indicating that we should be a threat to them.
Today, Syria is the world's #1 haven for international Islamists. But behind the sensational headlines, the civilian population has been forgotten. Millions of Syrians still face bombs, starvation and a freezing winter. And vicious mafias have filled the vacuum where the regime once held power.
Now you're going to struggle to walk now, it's really thick mud.
Aid worker Tawqir Sharif shows me around a refugee camp that has just been devastated by a flash flood.
As you can see, these are the people that are the worst hit. Look how thick the mud is. Can you see how thick the mud is? And most of these houses, most of the tents, I think they've already moved them. But you can see, look, that guy's tent over there is completely flooded.
ما فيها شيء طاول صوبات منا حرامات منا سفنجات
طلع العادية طلع على الطفل طلع ما بتقلب القلب طلع كيف عم ترجعه مو حرام لا يا قلبي لا يا قلبي لا طلع على الأطفال يا حرام
كلياتنا عم يسرقوا من بعضهم روحوا جيبوا لنا عالم اولاد حلال يستلمونا عشان ما ناكل بعضنا اخر شيء يعني عم يبعثوا لنا من برا اخيو شيء ما بنوصف عم يوصلنا اخيو هيك.
He's talking about many things, corruption, exploitation. He said now the camp managers here, they're like gangsters, they go around with guns, so everybody's afraid of them, so no one speaks out. He was saying, yani, we're Muslims, where's the Islam?
It's among this population that the ideological struggle for Syria's future is taking place. ISIS and Nusra are warring over territory, but there are also rivals for popular support.
What does Al-Qaeda want?
Firstly, we want to remove Bashar al-Assad and his regime and ensure that he is neither replaced with another dictator nor that a Russian client government is replaced by a Western client state. The new government must be one which genuinely serves the interests of the people. Now, what does that practically mean here? We want to restore the right of the Muslim people to choose their leaders independently and to establish just governance through an Islamic system that we know as Shura.
al-Nusra are too varied to let me film freely. But in between my meetings with them, I also spent time with their allies from the Islamic Front rebel coalition, who showed me how, from subsidized grocery shops, pharmacies and clinics, to this Islamic Front representative giving out bread on the street, they've already replaced the mechanisms of the Syrian state with their own social welfare and judicial system. At this Islamic Front hospital in Idlib, the victims of a barrel bombing had just arrived.
60 people was injured in this attack and about 15 one was killed. My people are killed by Bashar al-Assad and his regime because they called Bashar al-Assad just one thing, leave, we want to leave. Just leave, we want to leave. And no one answer us.
And I filmed a couple of cases at an Islamic Front Sharia court.
It's stability. Law and order, unfortunately, is what people crave today. And this more brutal kind of Islamist party that can assert its authority over all the other militias is popular because people just want to know who's boss and how to get things done and have some normalcy in their lives.
I asked Abu Sulayman about human rights under Sharia.
Look, every society needs a penal code. And having said that, I will not be apologetic about any aspect of Islam. In the US, for example, after spending possibly decades in solitary confinement, they will drag a man out of his cell, strap him to a table and pump him with a cocktail of chemicals until he eventually dies. But of course, he can choose his last meal, which somehow makes it all humane. Now, we have our penal code in which punishments are appropriate to the crimes committed and act as a deterrent for others. Islam to us is whole and complete, and that does include corporal and capital punishment.
The Islamic Front rebels I met seemed to agree.
What about people who are not religious?
in Syria.
نحن جربنا ذلك في السابق ولا نريد محاولة أن نعيش علمانية أخرى. نريد الإسلام. We want Islam.
You think that as the Assad rule represents secular law?
Yes.
Alemani law.
كيابو غيس والله غير. على راسي. حربي. Circle.
Area. My village. They are playing a circling around this village.
Yes.
Bomb?
Yes.
We heard a big blast, a bomb, and they estimated that it was approximately 8 kilometers from here. Two bombs. It was a new blast.
Around of my village.
Yes.
4 kilos.
Kind of scary. It gets closer all the time, you know.
والله وجبل الزاوي من حي تراب وشبيحة الأسد عيد سوار وتربوا.
Abandoned by the outside world, Syria's Sunni community seems to be solidifying around its religious identity.
So the 20% religious minorities who, of course, don't want anything to do with Islamic rule. But amongst Sunni Arabs, it's a language of justice and virtue that everybody understands.
Back in Syria, I was still trying to understand the ideology that draws young men from abroad to risk everything in this conflict.
What is your role in this revolution?
To fight in the path of Allah, to remove the Bashar regime and to protect the Muslims. The recent revolutions, you know, their aims is to remove the oppression and, you know, hopefully implement Islam and the Islamic justice. But then you find the West, they would say, is a threat to their superpower, because as you can see, the West and, you know, their choice of capitalism causes a lot of injustice. So if people see the light of Islam and the justice of Islam, that would cause the spread of it, and that's something they wouldn't want.
Can you tell me what happened recently with your brother?
Yeah, so his name was Jafar, and he was 17 years old. And we were offered a behind enemy lines operation.
So he's dead now. How did you feel when you heard?
SubhanAllah, I felt with calmness. My legs shook a little bit, but then, you know, the first thoughts I had was, inshallah, Allah accepts him as the best of martyrs. No.
He was really young. Do you think he was mature enough to understand what he was going into?
He was young in age, but not in wisdom, nor in maturity.
You've lost 2 brothers now.
The first feeling that comes is that I'm happy for them, you know, that they were killed in the path of Allah.
As rebels took control of the north, Muslims from all over the world flocked here. Some came to fight, others came to build a new Islamic utopia, and others came to do aid work. While I'm hanging around waiting to meet the Nusra fighters, I meet a Danish relief worker, Alexander, in a refugee camp near the border.
Vi er ved at bygge den nye moské her. Og så det eneste ligesom, samlingspunkt det her. Så det er meget, meget vigtigt for dem.
Tomorrow, Alexander is making an extremely dangerous journey to deliver aid to the frontline city of Aleppo.
Det er vores nødhjælpslager. Vi har lidt system i rådet. Der er vores hospitalsudstyr og medicin her. Jeg ved, og jeg er sikker på, at jeg gør en stor forskel for rigtig, rigtig mange mennesker ved hjælp af det, jeg gør. Jeg får ikke nogen løn for det arbejde, jeg udfører her. Jeg gør det her fuldstændig frivilligt. Jeg får min belønning et andet sted forhåbentlig.
I'm traveling with Alexander into Aleppo today because a British jihadi who's fighting here has agreed to talk to me. We are lucky it's cloudy. Government helicopters are smashing the city into rubble, routinely dropping explosives in the form of crude, improvised barrel bombs. But today the cloud cover means they can't see to aim.
The front line is actually right there.
He starts to figure out a way to get past the snipers into the frontline neighborhood of Salahuddin.
لا أخاف لا أخاف ما بخاف إلا من ربنا.
Vi kan høre sniperen ligger og skyder nu her. Han har sikkert set noget bevæge sig eller et eller andet, så ligger og skyder efter det.
Civilian families are still living in the midst of the heaviest fighting because this is the safest place to hide from the bombs. They're so inaccurate, just barrels filled with TNT and shrapnel, that pilots can't be sure of not hitting their own troops.
عجل شوي عجل بس هون شوي. En sniper, der skød efter bilen foran os.
Those still left here are mostly too poor or too sick to flee. And it's impossible to describe how terrifying life is here underneath the bombs. The British jihadi I meet has agreed to talk only if his identity is concealed. He tells me that what he's doing is an act of solidarity with civilians who are suffering. Though he fights for Nusra, he hasn't yet sworn allegiance, but he justifies attacking the West according to geopolitical arguments.
Every time we try to build fair, free, or independent governments anywhere in the world, they're subverted and overthrown by foreign powers for their own interests. Anyone should be able to understand why Al-Qaeda chooses to target the international powers that are responsible for this.
Elsewhere in Aleppo, I asked people what they thought about the US strikes against Nusra.
لأنهم جزء لا يتجزأ من هذه الثورة. جزء لا يتجزأ من هذه الثورة، ونحن نستنكر بشدة الضربات الموجهة إليهم. يعني أحسن ما يروحوا يضربوا هالثوار هي يروحوا يضربوا هالنظام المجرم هذا.
America could have removed Assad whenever they wanted to, but they didn't. The bottom line is that Assad is their best option in Syria at the moment, because he serves their interest the best. They don't want popular rule in the Middle East, because Arabs feel for their brothers in Palestine, and because America doesn't want an Islamic group gaining a stronghold or legitimacy in the Middle East, because a strong Islamic nation will never be subservient to foreign interests.
What was already a bitter sectarian conflict seems to have become more polarized since the coalition began targeting Nusra. For many here, this is evidence that the West is now siding with Assad.
أمريكا لم تنصر المستضعفين، أمريكا أبت إلا أن تكون ضد المسلمين، وهذا هو اعتداء على الشعب السوري وعلى ثورته وقيمه وحريته. وجبهة النصرة هي من يقاتل النظام في سوريا. وفي الحقيقة الشعب السوري شعب ظلم جدا، والله سبحانه وتعالى أرسل رجالا صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله والحمد لله.
The West has to realize that the Syrian people aren't fighting to establish a carbon copy of a Western secular democracy. They're Muslim people fighting to establish what they want, an independent Islamic government. Call that what you will, but it's not terrorism.
As the Syrian civil war moves into its 5th year, this part of the country is securely in the hands of the Islamists. Whatever the response of the outside world, it's hard to imagine a scenario that doesn't risk further deepening the sectarian divisions or driving more young men into an early grave.